su doctorado en la Universidad de Estocolmo, en Suecia, donde además tuvo una posición de profesor por muchos años antes de volver a Estados Unidos. Luego se movió por diversas universidades en ese país, como Carnegie Mellon, la Universidad de Austin en Texas, la Universidad de Nueva York y Princeton University, y finalmente se estableció en Los Ángeles, en la Universidad de California, antes de moverse a Harvard algunos años atrás. La mejor forma para describir sus intereses de investigación es algo que yo también pondría en forma de una pregunta, así como hice con Juan Carlos. Y esta vez no lo voy a citar directamente, pero lo voy a parafrasear. Jim, ¿podrías explicarnos cómo es que no importa lo que tratemos de hacer, los humanos nos arreglamos para construir sociedades jerárquicas y que algunos grupos opriman a otros? Tratando de responder esta pregunta, durante 30 años y hemos estado trabajando en desarrollar su trabajo más prominente, que es la teoría de la dominancia social, que bueno, fue publicado en el libro del mismo nombre, de Social Dominance, An Intergroup Theory of Social Hierarchies and Oppression, en el año 99. Y desde entonces, la publicación de ese libro se ha concentrado en desarrollar múltiples aspectos de esta teoría, recorriendo investigaciones en psicología cognitiva, psicología social clásica de las relaciones intergrupales y psicología evolutiva de las diferencias de género. Jim, estoy muy feliz de que estés acá y para nosotros es realmente un honor tenerte, así que por favor, el piso es tuyo.
Thank you, Hector. I'd like to thank Hector and his colleagues for inviting me to be able to speak to you this afternoon. And by introduction, I should mention the fact that I consider myself a refugee from the 1960s and the 19 civil rights movement in the United States. And what I came to as a conclusion after a little more than a decade of work within this movement is that despite the fact that there's been much progress made in civil rights in the United States under this period, that the civil rights movement was basically a failure. It was a failure in that it did not achieve its primary goals, which was to eliminate the effect of racism and sexism and classism in American society. They have attenuated these problems, are not as big as they used to be, but the basic structure and dynamics of oppression, class oppression, and race oppression and gender oppression have really more or less remained the same. And what I did, and what I'm going to be talking about with you today, are efforts, theoretical efforts we've made to try to understand better what is going on. Why are these systems of oppression so tenacious? Why are they so difficult to get rid of? And what I basically came up with after thinking about this for some time is that human social groups tend to be structured as group-based social hierarchies, with dominant groups at the top and subordinate groups at the bottom and intermediate groups in between. There seems to be a human universal. And given that universal observation of the nature of hierarchy across societies and across time, we make two basic assumptions. One is that since human social systems are ubiquitously, without exception, and I challenge anyone in this room to give me a counterexample of a society which is not based as a group-based hierarchy, that human societies are probably predisposed to organize themselves in this way. Secondly, that the common forms of social oppression, that is to say racism and sexism and classism and various kinds of religious oppression of Group A by Group B, are really special instantiations or special cases of the general tendency for human societies to form group-based hierarchies. So the primary goals of social dominance theory to try to identify the various mechanisms at different levels of analysis and their interactions, which are responsible for the production, the recreation, and maintenance of group-based social hierarchies. And the mechanisms that we have in mind are multifaceted. There are individual differences of situational constraints, the history of groups, social and group identities, legitimizing social ideologies, behavioral asymmetries, and the behavior of social institutions. And not only that, but the interaction among these various levels of analysis. In this talk, we're going to concentrate on the multi-leveled interaction between two levels of analysis. One, the individual level, and two, the institutional level. How do these two levels of analysis interact to help produce and maintain group-based inequality? We argue that the degree of group-based social hierarchy is regulated by the opposing effects of two forces. One set of forces which we call hierarchy-enhancing social agents, and the other hierarchy-attenuating social agents. Hierarchy-enhancing social agents are those social agents, social forces, which produce greater and greater levels of social inequality. Hierarchy-attenuating social forces are those which produce greater and greater levels of group-based social equality. And it's the interaction, the counteracting force between these two sets of opposing forces which determine the degree of hierarchy in any given society at any given time. The types of social agents we have in mind, these he and her social agents can be social ideologies like fascism and racism and sexism and capitalism, or hierarchy attenuating ideologies such as the universal rights of man, socialism, social democracy, or they can be he and her social stereotypes, or he or her social customs, or he and her social institutions. And it's the level of institutions we're going to concentrate on in this talk. I hope I'm not talking too fast. No. Okay. Examples of hierarchy-enhancing social institutions are things like internal security forces, like Stasi, the East German secret police under the communist regime, or the KGB, now known as FSB, or Sabak, or Black Plus, or any of a number of other secret police and secret organizations which help to promote and maintain group-based social inequality. Or hierarchy-enhancing social institutions can be sort of official and semi-official terrorist organizations, death squads, for example, or they can be large profit-maximizing financial and corporate organizations. The social effects of these three types of forces is to maintain and solidify group inequality between one group and another. Examples of hierarchy attenuating social forces are things like civil rights organizations, charities, public defender's office. Do people know what public defender's office are? These are lawyers who defend the poor and the indigent who can't afford to defend themselves. So I'm going to make four basic arguments in this talk. The first one is I'm going to assume that intergroup violence and terror are the normal components of intergroup relations, and whose function is to help maintain and foster group-based inequality. Two, I'm going to argue that under normal circumstances, this intergroup violence and terror are not simply carried out by small groups of ruffians like ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but by social institutions and governments as well. Three, In order for these hierarchy-enhancing social institutions to work most effectively, there's got to be, under normal circumstances, a matching or congruency between the hierarchical predispositions of individuals and the hierarchical predispositions of institutions. They're going to fit together in order to produce greater levels of group-based inequality. We call this hypothesis the hierarchy congruency hypothesis. 4, we're going to suggest that there are at least 4 different mechanisms which are responsible for matching individuals with specific kinds of he or ha behavioral predispositions with social institutions with which they're going to be consistent and congruent. Processes of matching personalities into appropriate social roles be things like, obviously, self-selection processes, institutional selection, that institutions select out individuals from the larger population who seem to have social values and behavioral predispositions which are consistent with the organizations they're joining. 3, institutional socialization. Once you're in an organization, there'll be social pressure on you to conform to the norms and practices of that institution, even those norms and practices which have to do with the promotion of group inequality and hierarchy. And 4, there'll be differential rewards and punishment for the degree of consistency between the individual and the institution. For those individuals who are well matched in hierarchical terms to the roles that they're playing, they will be rewarded. And those who are not well matched ideologically to the social role that they're performing will be punished. Okay? So we can think of, I want you to think of the criminal justice system in general, not just in the United States or Chile or the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union or South Africa, but in general, the criminal justice system is a form of institutional terror. That is to say, keeping in mind that the state is in all societies without exception disproportionately controlled by members of the dominant group. That leads to the phenomenon that violence exercised by the state is going to have a large component of group-based violence, of dominant groups doing violence to subordinate groups. Yeah, we just said that. All right. When I say that the state produces acts of terrorism, we're not just engaging in hyperbole, although there is some of that. But if we go to the dictionary, the American Heritage Dictionary, we can find a definition of it, which is violence committed or threatened by a group to intimidate or coerce a population as for political and military purposes. This is to say that the exercise of violence is, for political purposes, is not only carried out by small terrorist groups, but by states and whole societies and dominant groups in general. As an example of this, I'm going to give you some data looking at death penalty sentences carried out in North America before there was the United States between 1608 and 1991. And there were 13,923 of these executions. Now we're going to argue that you can execute people in different ways. You can do it in a very brutal fashion or somewhat less brutal fashion. And what we have argued is that if the exercise of state terror is an instrument of terrorism against subordinate groups, then when subordinate groups commit punishable crimes, they will tend to be executed in much more brutal ways than those who are members of dominant groups. There'll be a differential level of brutality involved. And we looked at 3 levels of brutality in this data set. One was humane executions, asphyxiation, shooting, and legal injection, or moderately brutal forms of execution, such as hanging and electrocution, and very brutal forms of execution, crushing on the wheel, breaking on the wheel, burning, hanging in chains, etc. Does anybody know what breaking on the wheel is? This is a form of execution where you take a human body and you make it fit around a wagon wheel. In order to do that, you have to break people's bones, their arms, and their legs, so that they fit neatly around this wagon wheel. Okay? So the argument would be that subordinates are going to be tortured and murdered in this way to a significantly greater extent than more members of dominant groups who are going to be executed. And this is what the data show. If we look at this column here, this is not very visible. Humane forms of execution, we used 61% of such forms were used against dominants. These are white Americans, European Americans, and 39% against African Americans. So there is a preponderance for European Americans are executed in more humane ways. In moderately brutal forms of execution, it's about 50-50. It's about half. In very brutal forms of execution, it's overwhelmingly members of the African American community, and this is not, well, here we go, who are executed in this fashion, and only about 12% are European Americans. So there is this tendency to punish subordinates much more severely. Okay? Well, this isn't simply ancient history. This happens contemporary, right now, as we speak. This is a study carried out by Jack Glazer and his colleagues in 2015. It looks at the punishment meted out to white and black defendants if the law, depending on what the law allows. If the law allows life, only allows life without the possibility of parole, then the likelihood of a guilty verdict with this result is about equal for black and white defendants. But under a situation in which the maximum sentence allowed is the death penalty, then there is a much greater probability that those put to death will be African Americans and not European Americans. Okay? Well, those are formal forms of brutality and terrorism. What about informal forms, like lynching, for example? So between the years of 1859 and 1962, there were some 5,000 lynchings of African Americans. And these lynchings were associated often with very extreme forms of violence, including sadism, like the cutting off of fingers and extremities, castration, and burning alive. As an example of this, we see this execution in 1919 of a young man, William Brown, who was castrated and then burned alive on this funeral pyre, on this fire. Well, this is not, again, it's not ancient history, and as I'm going to show in a minute, it's not restricted to the United States. It's a general phenomenon. Okay? These are the estimated probabilities of getting a death sentence for those who committed capital crimes, depending upon the race of the perpetrator and the race of the victim, as a function of the culpability of the crime. So the more severe the crime for all categories, the more likely the death penalty was to be used. But there are very different probabilities of being executed depending upon the combination of the victim's race and the perpetrator's race. So you're least likely, at average levels of culpability, you're least likely to get a death sentence if you're a white defendant and you're killing a black victim. Somewhat higher likelihood of being executed if you're a white defendant killing a non-black a white victim. And the highest probabilities of being executed are black defendants killing a white victim or black defendants killing a black victim. Okay? So that the results of the state's brutality depends upon the combination of the victim and the perpetrator. Well, this is again not simply restricted to one state in Philadelphia where these previous results come from, but it's a general tendency across the United States. And what we looked at here was whether a state in the United States had the death penalty as a function of how hierarchically structured that state was, controlling for all of these other variables here. And we defined social hierarchy by using 3 indices. One of them was social class by use of the Gini index. How unequal was the state? Caste inequality, the degree to which African Americans were underrepresented in the state legislature, and 3, the degree to which women were underrepresented in the state legislature. You put them together, net of all these other factors, whether the degree of social hierarchy within the state makes a great difference in terms of who is to be executed or not. This, again, is not restricted to the American phenomenon, although I have a lot of American data. Because one of the things I did with my graduate student when we published this is look at the tendency for the degree of hierarchy within a nation to be correlated with the degree of inequality within that nation. And we looked at this relationship across 147 different countries and found basically the same phenomenon. That is to say, independent of these variables here, these control variables, the degree to which a nation was hierarchically structured is the degree to which that nation was likely to use punishment or the death penalty. And then remember, the death penalty is disproportionately directed towards subordinates, not dominants. Okay, let's look at the legitimizing ideologies supporting the death penalty. People support the death penalty in the United States and other countries for 2 major reasons. First one is deterrence. That is to say, if you threaten to kill somebody, you're less likely to get the offending behavior. Right? And second, as a reason for retribution, an eye for an eye. People should pay for their crimes. Right? And we don't doubt at all that these ideologies are in fact related to supporting the death penalty. But we do argue that these reasons, these legitimizing ideologies, if you will, are not exogenous. And by that I mean they're not independent of the desire to maintain and establish group-based social inequality. And that we measured by the use of an instrument we've been developing over the years called social dominance orientation. And social dominance orientation relates to the degree to which people prefer, like, vote for, are comfortable with group-based social inequality. The higher the SDO level, the more comfortable people feel with social inequality. And it was measured by things like, items like, to get ahead in life it's necessary to step on other groups, inferior groups should stay in their place, superior groups should dominate inferior groups, and all groups should be given an equal chance in life. It's the obverse of the others. There's 16 questions like this. And we argue the following model, that deterrence, in both its general and specific forms, will be related to harsh criminal sanctions, like the death penalty. So will retribution be a factor which contributes to willingness or the desire to execute people, but that these 3 legitimizing ideologies are not exogenous. They're not independent of the desire to create group inequality. And that we measured by SDO. And so this is our theoretical model. And this is what the data show, okay, using a manifest variable structural equation model. In this particular model, SDO has no direct effect on death penalty support, but it does have significant indirect effects via general deterrence, specific deterrence, and retribution. That is to say, one of the major reasons why people support the death penalty and justify it in terms of these ideologies is because they would like to maintain group inequality. One consequence of the criminal justice system as an instrument of terror should be the disproportionate targeting of dominance and subordinates. This is an example of multiple kinds of data which show that there is a huge disproportion of those based upon their race who are imprisoned in the criminal justice system. So what this basically shows is that African American males have a 33% chance of being imprisoned sometime in their life. 1 out of 3 will be imprisoned. For Latino Americans, it's 17%. For European Americans, about 6%. And this is achieved, among other things, by the disproportionate picking out of members of subordinate groups for punishment and imprisonment. These are not the only, discrimination is not the only reason for this. There is also the fact that there are disproportionate levels of certain kinds of criminality between these groups. But that is not independent, we argue, of the fact that there is subordination of these groups by dominance. I'm arguing here most vociferously that this is not an American phenomenon. Nothing about it is an American phenomenon. It's a universal phenomenon. One piece of good evidence of this is data taken from the OECD in the late 90s. What this shows for these several countries is the level of imprisonment of foreign inmates in the prisons. How many foreigners are in the prison system in these countries? The proportion of these foreigners in the prison system, the proportion of the foreigners in the general population, and if we divide this by this, we get the degree to which they are overrepresented in the prison system. And if the number is positive, plus is positive, then the degree of overrepresentation is positive. That is to say, you're more likely to be imprisoned if you're a foreigner than members of the native population. And what's to be looked at, particularly here, is that the United States places midpoint in the distribution approximately. Yes, subordinates are much more likely to be imprisoned than dominants, but not severely so compared to people in Spain, Italy, Greece, Netherlands, Portugal, Sweden, okay, and all these other countries. It's about an average degree of overrepresentation of subordinates within the prison system. The installation of fear. One of the purposes of institutional and government violence against subordinates is to instill fear in members of subordinate groups. There's no point in going through all these exercises with punishment and brutality if the subordinates aren't picking up the message. Okay? And we can see how that works out. This is one of several graphs we could show you. Looking at the degree of fear members of Los Angeles County, a random sample of about 2,000 members of Los Angeles County, feared the police. That was the question. How afraid are you of the police? That was the simple question. And the issue was, is there a differential fear of the police depending upon your social status, net of everything else? And what this shows is, if you look at poor people, people in the middle class, and wealthy people, there is a systematic relationship, even under controls for race and ethnicity and levels of education, that subordinates are substantially more afraid of the police than our dominants. which should be the case. So the subordinates are getting the message. They are in more danger than members of dominant groups. Okay, the hierarchy congruency hypothesis. If the hierarchy enhancing and hierarchy attenuating organizations are functioning in the way they're supposed to function theoretically, then we should find a matching between the appropriate personalities and behavioral dispositions of individuals and the hierarchical character of social institutions. They should fit together nicely. Okay? That is to say, he organizations should be disproportionately staffed by people with high levels of dominance orientation, and ha organizations should be disproportionately staffed by members of ha organizations. Example. This is a study we also did in Los Angeles County using representative samples of people who are public defenders. These are the warm and fuzzies of our story, but the hierarchy attenuators, compared to university students, compared to people selected for jury duty, compared to police officers. And the dependent variable here was level of dominance orientation. And it should be the case that police officers, even when you control for race and gender and income, are substantially higher in SDO than are ordinary members of the public, jurors, students, and members of the public defender's office. So the ideological difference between these institutions and what they should be, given the theory. So how does this happen? How does it happen that people with very high levels of dominance orientation tend to accommodate themselves to hierarchy-enhancing institutions? Well, there are at least 4 mechanisms that we mentioned before. One of them is self-selection. And to look at some evidence for the matching of people with certain values to certain organizations, we did a career attractiveness study. And we took a large number of undergraduate students and asked them what they wanted to be when they grew up, when they graduated from college, what kind of career, as a function of the level of dominance orientation of the citizen. And we looked at several hierarchy-enhancing or he careers, like working as a lawyer for the government, working to enforce the law, working for the FBI, etc. The idea being that the higher the student's dominance score, the more they wanted to attach themselves to he organizations and reverse. What about ha organizations, the warm and fuzzy organizations, the organizations trying to promote greater levels of social equality? And these are examples of those organizations here. Okay. So what did the results show? Well, the results show that there was in fact a positive correlation between the degree to which you wanted to have dominant groups over subordinate groups and the attractiveness of these professions. It's not huge, but it is substantial. They are systematic. The only one exception was this government prosecutor did not relate to SDO. We also looked at the degree to which people's high SDO scores correlated with the perceived attractiveness of warm and fuzzy organizations. And these relationships were much stronger and negative. It's not simply that high SDO people prefer he jobs, but high SDO individuals really get turned off by, dislike, don't want to have anything to do with warm and fuzzy professions. Okay, there's a differential sorting. Right? Secondly, institutional selection pressures or processes. This is an experiment we did looking at whether he and ha employment history would be associated with the likelihood of being hired for a he or ha job. And we looked at applicants' employment histories and control for the type of job we're looking at. And we looked at jobs which are he in character or ha in character, based upon the person's job experience. And job histories were like this. Had experience as a camp counselor selected, da-da-da-da-da. What is this job? Is this a he job history or a ha job history? Ha. It is he job history. Okay. This is a he job history. Compared to this job history here. Okay, this is a ha job history. Well, what kinds of jobs are people seeking employment at? Well, here is one kind of job that was being advertised for. And what kind of job is this? He or ha? This is a ha job, helping the poor, the indigent, helping poor people and sick people and people who are not able to do for themselves. As opposed to the same job at a paralegal aid, which is described as a he job. So will people, the question is, will people with hierarchy enhancing or hierarchy attenuating job histories be chosen disproportionately to fill roles in hierarchy enhancing or hierarchy attenuating jobs, is the issue. And this is exactly what the data show. That is to say, for he jobs, people with ha job histories are much more likely to be picked out for those jobs, to be hired for those jobs. Whereas people with he job histories are much more likely to be hired for he jobs. There is a sorting that goes on. Okay. People with the appropriate attitudes join the appropriate institutions. Institutional socialization. I'm running out of time, so I'm only going to give one example of this. This is a study done in 1975, and it looked at police officers in the police academy as they went through the police academy training. And what the data show is the longer they were exposed to police academy socializations, the more hostile they were to ethnic minorities, African Americans in particular. There are several studies of this type, but we don't have time to go through all of them. So we'll just take out one. This, however, is a study which I think is really quite beautiful and simple. It's a study done by Serge Guimond in 2000 in the European Journal of Social Psychology. And what it shows is the level of anti-immigrant hostility, which is here, the higher the bar, the more positive people were to foreign immigrants. And what they did was look at this among military officers in the Canadian military in the first year of the training in the military and after 4 years. So it's a panel study. And what these data show is the longer recruits are exposed to Canadian military training, the what? The less positive to foreign immigrants they are. But the real beauty of this study is in this distinction here. Serge argued that for military officers who are not really into the role of military officers, who didn't care all that much one way or the other, there was a mild socialization process. So the higher the exposure to the Canadian military, the less positive they were to foreign immigrants. But that really took off for officers who were highly identified with the social role as Canadian military officers. For them, the socialization was much stronger. A much greater difference between their initial attitudes and their attitudes towards foreigners 4 years later. Last sorting mechanism. And what example should I give here? We'll give this example here. The Rodney King beating. You probably, or some of you might remember the major event in the United States where a motorist, a black motorist, his name was Rodney King, was beaten within an inch of his life by the LAPD. There was a major eruption as a result, a civil disobedience, the largest in American history, and a commission was assigned to look into this event. Okay? And what they found was they studied the likelihood of people making complaints against the LAPD and having those LAPD officers dismissed for brutality. And what they found was there were 3,419 such complaints between 1986 and 1990. And of those 3,400 complaints, 97 of them were not found to be sustained. They were just dismissed out of hand. 3% were sustained. That is to say, the authorities said there was something here. Of that 3%, only 7.6% resulted in the dismissal of the officer. So if you are a resident of Los Angeles County and you make a complaint for a police officer beating the living bejesus out of you, what's the likelihood that that complaint will lead to a dismissal of the officer? It is 3% of 7%, 7.6%, or essentially 0. Okay? Functionally 0. Well, what the commission did that was studying this police behavior is look at the personnel records of the 44 officers in the LAPD who had the highest number of complaints for brutality. And what they discovered was those 44 very brutal officers tended not to be criticized by their supervisors, but they tended to be rewarded. The more consistent, the more brutal the officer's behavior, the more likely they were to get commendations, recommendations for promotion, higher salaries, all of this thing. Okay? They went through that. So we decided to check out this phenomena in the lab, okay? To do an experiment to see whether or not consistency between personality and institutions was associated with reward, differential reward. And we did it in the following manner. We took a large, very valid measure of racism and divided up about 5,000 students, and we divided it up into those who had low racism scores and those who had high racism scores. And then we looked at he majors and ha majors and the university. What kind of careers were these students preparing for? And we found the following. We defined congruence as students with low racism scores in ha majors, or high racism scores with he majors. They're those people where they should be, in other words. We define incongruence as those students with low racism scores in he majors, or high racism scores in ha majors. And we reasoned that there should be differential reward within the university depending upon whether you were congruent or incongruent. And how did we define a university reward? How do universities reward students? By grades. Okay? So the prediction is that these students in green will get relatively high grades, and the students in red will get relatively low grades. Okay? And first I'm going to show you how we defined attenuating majors. There were majors like this. These are the warm and fuzzy majors. Okay? And the Genghis Khan majors were majors like this. Okay? Looking at the data and the relationships, well, before we get to that, we first have to discover whether he and her majors are differentially racist or not. If they're not, then this whole logic falls to pieces. So this is what we looked at. We compared the racism scores of he majors, ordinary students who were neither he nor ha, and ha majors, and found that these guys, the Genghis Khans, were in fact more racist than the ordinary students, and these warm and fuzzies were less racist than ordinary students. So it makes sense to do this kind of analysis. And what did the data show? The following. For those who get low GPAs to high GPAs, students with low GPAs are disproportionately incongruent. There's a discrepancy between their racism scores and the majors that they're in. But the greater the congruence between the major and the person's ideology, the more successful they were in the university. And we've been able to replicate this in additional studies. So to get to conclusions, because we're running out of time, we're basically saying that rather than being extraordinary events, intergroup violence are ordinary low-level aspects of intergroup discourse. 2, under normal circumstances, this intergroup violence and terror are enacted by hierarchy enhancing social institutions. 3, helping ensure this enactment of these roles and institutional violence is the congruence between dominance orientation of individuals and the dominance orientation of institutions. And the factors which are responsible for the matching up of ideologies of individuals and the character of institutions are 4, their self-selection mechanisms, institutional selection mechanisms, institutional socialization, and differential rewards. And at that point, we'll skip over this. Well, that's the end.
Preguntas, sin embargo, necesito que las preguntas sean de la siguiente forma, porque para que los traductores puedan escuchar las preguntas hay que hablar en el micrófono. Entonces, alternativamente, las personas que quieran hacer preguntas pueden acercarse y ocupar uno de los micrófonos o hacernos llegar las preguntas de forma escrita y nosotros las podemos leer. Así que, digamos, ambas. Así que, bueno, abro el espacio para las preguntas. Jimena.
Es más fácil.
Agradezco la oportunidad de hacerle esta pregunta. Me parece que... Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I don't have a translation.
Thank you for having the opportunity to ask you what I'm going to ask.
Okay.
It's the other one.
You can start asking.
Las personas que están escuchando la traducción al español, ¿escucharon traducida esta pregunta? Sí. Ya, ok. Sigamos.
Yeah. Es una oportunidad interesante de poder contestarse la pregunta en psicología social de las relaciones intergrupales acerca de si es que las relaciones entre grupos o por qué las relaciones entre grupos tienden a ser hostiles más que de cooperación. ¿Ah? En el
Are you getting?
No, but I have it came off, so continue. Yes, continue.
Porque desde la perspectiva clásica del psicólogo británico Henry Tafel, no era británico, sí era húngaro parece, de origen. o sea, cuando yo les explico a mis estudiantes la teoría de la identidad social de Tagfeld, siempre aparece la pregunta de ¿por qué las relaciones tienen que ser hostiles? ¿Por qué tienen que ser de competencia? Y esta propuesta de entender que ordenar las diferencias jerárquicamente por cuál es más valiosa, cuál es menos valiosa, pareciera estar casi como ser parte como de la naturaleza de las relaciones sociales. Y eso me parece coherente, pero ¿qué pasaría si en vez de tener estas instituciones y estas instituciones H-I, más fuertes que las instituciones, en vez de tener las H-I más fuertes que las H-A, si tuviéramos las J más fuertes que las otras? O sea, ¿eso sería posible de pensarlo en ese modelo o la constante de la jerarquización es tal que ni siquiera eso se cuestiona? Porque la forma que tenemos de vivir en la cultura occidental hoy en día privilegia la competencia, pero podríamos tener relaciones de cooperación. Entonces, como que si usted se ha planteado la posibilidad de revertir esos equilibrios, para pensar si es que esto es algo tan natural, tan impreso en la naturaleza humana, o es algo más pensable de otro modo. ¿Se entiende?
I think I understand your question. And my answer to it is the relationship social hierarchy does not have to be based upon necessarily manifest levels of violence, but by implied or theoretical or latent levels of violence. If we take a society like India, which has been very hierarchical, group-based hierarchical for thousands of years, as far as we can tell, it's been hierarchically organized in this fashion for at least 4,000 years. And for the most part, this hierarchy is continued by non-violent means. But people sort of know what the edges of it are, how much equality is going to be possible within this society. So it's not simply based on manifest, out-in-your-face aggression, but by the implied forces allied to make sure that this balance is kept. And whether or not a degree of hierarchy can be changed to be less hierarchical, there's no question that it can be. That Ha forces can be, under certain circumstances, more powerful than He forces. But we're simply arguing that the degree of balance or imbalance in the Ha direction of these social forces is never going to be strong enough to eliminate group-based social inequality. Because we say that simply because over looking at 5,000 or 6,000 years of written, recorded human history, and looking at the social behavior of the primates which are most closely related to us, we don't see instances of egalitarianism, just differing degrees of hierarchy. There's no empirical evidence to support that. I hope that's an answer to your question.
Siguiente pregunta. Las personas que quieran hacer preguntas escritas se pueden llegar a Carolina o a Nicolás. O pueden pasar. Adelante.
If I say it in English, I need to go there.
Las personas que no hablan inglés no van a escuchar tu pregunta.
¿Por qué te la puedo decir en inglés?
Ok.
Creo que es difícil. So thank you very much for the talk, Jim. It was very interesting. And I was wondering if there's any relation between the SDO tendencies and the dehumanization tendencies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there is. I mean, we've just published a report.
I need to say it in Spanish. Sorry. Mi pregunta es si hay una relación entre la SDO, nuestra tendencia, bueno, sí, lo que está explicando él, ¿no? Como identificar las jerarquías entre grupos, y la tendencia a la deshumanización, ¿no? Como a percibir a otro grupo menos humano, otros grupos que no son nuestros como menos humanos. Parece que puede existir alguna relación entre esos dos conceptos. Mira.
Can I get a translation of that?
I said,
That was a translation. The original question was, is there a relationship between dehumanization and SDO? And the answer to that is yes. One of my students in my lab, research lab, has just published a paper looking at degrees of dehumanization of members of outgroups and a person's level of SDO. So the higher the SDO, the more likely people are to dehumanize the other. There's very clear evidence of that. Right. And that makes sense if SDO's function is to help create group-based inequality, that one assume that inequality to start with. Yes.
¿Más preguntas, Juan Carlos?
Translation issue.
Una pregunta breve respecto de si hay evidencia de algunas investigaciones respecto de SDO, pero a nivel escolar, y cómo los contextos en las escuelas, en los niños, si las escuelas también pueden ser vistas como como instituciones que atenúan o mitigan la dominancia social. ¿Tiene cierta influencia en el nivel de dominancia social de estos niños en las escuelas y también a futuro, digamos? Pensando en la dominancia social, o sea, me imagino que hay una relación importante, por lo mismo que se mostró acá, a nivel adulto, con procesos de socialización y cómo estas actitudes de más o menos dominancia se adquieren.
Yes, we in fact have some empirical evidence showing the relationship between SDO and all of the kinds of criteria one would expect, like willingness to deal with immigrant children in school, or approval of violence against other countries in 14, 15, and 16-year-old individuals. So this tendency, we think, is partly a part of one's temperament that you're born with, and partly a function of the social category that you belong to. So if you are born into dominant and high status and powerful groups, you're more likely to think it's okay to have social inequality. Right? So both factors are working. One from the time you're born, which is temperamental, a lack of empathy, which is temperamental, and socialization within the society the sub-society that you're born in. So both factors are working. At least two factors.
Some evidence about disentangling these two effects, maybe with this twin studies, maybe? Have you done something like that?
We haven't done twin studies, but we're in the process of publishing a paper looking at the longitudinal effects of SDO on kids as they grow up through high school. And so we do have SDO data on fairly young kids, not infants or children yet. We haven't done that yet. But we suspect that there would also be SDO differences even among 6, 7, and 8-year-olds.
¿Alguna pregunta que sea escrita? Bueno.
Was I talking too fast with the audience?
No. Okay. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes por participar, y muchas gracias, Jim, por acompañarnos. Thank you very much, Jim, for
thank you.
Coming down the sound. Todos invitados a la siguiente sesión del coloquio, que va a ser el último viernes de octubre. Así que esperamos verlos a todos, y recuerden registrarse en la red de Psicología Política en nuestro sitio psicopolítica.cl. Muchas gracias.